Hello and welcome to How to See Spiritually with me, Mark Vernon, a series of discussions about the intuitive, about the eye of the soul. If you like the talk, please do share it, make comments, and also visit my website. In this episode, I wanted to talk about virtues. Now, I think that when spiritual traditions collapse into moral systems, this is a major error, a major mistake. Because they then just become part of this world, maybe good in themselves. No one's saying that loving thy neighbour is not a good thing to do. But if that becomes the end of the spiritual tradition, then it doesn't actually take the individuals anywhere else. It doesn't develop their sight, their perception. All that it does is keep them in this world feeling burdened by it, rather than leading to another country, to use the Christian expression. And then spontaneously, as it were, good behaviour flows from that. It's a byproduct of seeing more spiritually. So I think that the moral collapse of modern Christianity, particularly I'm thinking of, is a major mistake. It's part, I think, of Christianity's lack of appeal. But there is another way of talking about this area, which is to think about, instead of morality, which always feels like rules and regulations to me, to talk about virtues. Now, virtues are characteristics or qualities of our personality. They're our kind of habits that we utilise when we go through life. And it's about how we respond to things that happen. Traditionally, there are said to be 4 cardinal virtues. Cardinal coming from the Latin for hinge. They're the kind of qualities of life which, if we have them, life tends to hinge quite well. So they will be temperance, which I gloss as sort of responding calmly to what happens, keeping your mind, you might say. Prudence, which I think of as responding sort of wisely. It's not knowing it all, for sure, but it is knowing what a good next step might be. So sort of responding wisely would be prudence. Courage, which is responding bravely. So we've said a lot about how spiritual life is stepping into the unknown, into uncertainty, and being able to tolerate doubt. And that requires a kind of existential bravery to venture forth. Neither being foolhardy and saying too much, as it were, and believing too much, thinking too much, but neither being timid and not perceiving enough, fearing where this journey might lead. So that's something about courage, responding bravely. And then the 4th traditional cardinal virtue is justice, which is about place, about knowing your place in relation to others, having your ego in the service of wider life, you might say these days. And more broadly in relation to nature and even the gods as well. That was how justice was thought about. Thinking about writers like Aristotle, who wrote a lot about these 4 cardinal virtues, and were then picked up in the Christian period. There are many other virtues, of course, others that belong to other traditions. One that's talked about quite a lot in the West now is metta, from the Buddhist tradition, which is about befriending things. So having a sort of relationship with what's going on. And that's very different from trying to cut them off, pretend they don't occur, or being overwhelmed with them, so you can almost see nothing else. You know, when you have a friend, you have a connection, but also a kind of distance that enables you to be yourself and them to be themselves. And so the virtue of metta is about going through life and befriending it, engaging with it, relating to it. That's a very valuable spiritual virtue. Faith, hope and love would be the other Christian ones, which are very widely celebrated. Now, virtues I think are so important because they're what you might call the spiritual version of this byproduct called behaving well, morality. They're not provable. They're not like laws that everybody would agree if they reasoned it out. They're not measurable either. They're something which is adaptive, and in fact often learns more from mistakes in life than when things go well. A really nice analogy that Aristotle used was the idea of the archer, someone who shoots arrows at targets. And he said that they're a kind of virtuous person when they do it well, because they always know how to hit the target of life. It may be sunshine, it may be raining, it may be windy, they may be walking, standing still, on horseback. whatever life throws at them, they know how to respond in order to pull back the bow, release the arrow and hit the target. They become a virtuous person. And he thought that that's what our characteristics of prudence and justice, temperance and courage need to be like as well. They're sort of flexible and adaptive, which often means that they've learned from mistakes. Much like the archer is going to fail to hit the target when they're practicing, so too we must be prepared to learn from mistakes. So that makes it a very different conception from morality, as is often taught, where if you do wrong, it's regarded as bad. Actually, in a virtue conception of things, to make a mistake can be one of the best moments in life. It deepens your perception through the error. It opens up a different sense of things that then becomes more possible. It's similarly not about perfection. Being a virtuous person is not about being a perfect person. It's more actually about being a sort of flexible or adaptive person, or even a whole person, bringing all that you are into the situation, in order that all you are might be tried and tested by it, might be formed and forged by it, so that in time you come to resonate, as it were, from the bottom up with life and with what happens in the way that you're able to respond. Another difference, I think, is that in a virtue conception of things, the focus is on the journey rather than on the solution. So it's about continuing to engage, continuing to respond to life, developing these particular habits and qualities, rather than thinking this is the way to behave, this is what I must do. The rather more piecemeal approach, which characterises moral systems. The virtue approach is much more holistic. It's about all that happens and all that you are, bringing that to bear. And I hope, perhaps you can see why this is a much more spiritual conception of who we are and how we behave. And because spirituality too is nothing if not about a full perception of life. Seeing spiritually, this deeper perception, which I think we so much need in the modern world, has this ability to take in more expansively, more broadly, even all of things, rather than seeing life in rather piecemeal and fragmented ways. Here's a problem, I've got to solve it. Here's a moral dilemma, what's the way out of it? It rather transcends that approach to things, and instead tries to focus on who you're becoming in the situation, and trusting that will bring a different perspective, a different take on the situation as well. To borrow the analogy from Taoism, the virtue approach is much more like the water that flows around the rock than the hammer that tries to smash the rock, which would be to take, as it were, the obstacle, the moral problem away. So I want to encourage you to think about virtues, these qualities, personal characteristics, how they enable you to resonate with reality and so reveal more and more of reality to you. When people like Aristotle and Plato thought about virtues, they thought that some are just useful for the everyday, but they also thought that some have more transcendent quality. So we need the everyday ones, kind of getting through life, befriending and so on. But the capacity to sense what's good, beautiful and true, for example, in Plato, he called them the divine virtues, because they also open up not just everyday life, but transcendent life as well. The capacity to really engage with what's beautiful particularly. It's been said that beauty is the promise of happiness. It's nothing in itself in a way, beauty, but it promises something much, much more, which is why we're drawn towards it, why it has this incredibly powerful allure. And developing the personal qualities, characteristics that enable you to become more and more sensitive, alert to beauty. That's going to be part of spiritual perception as well. They ultimately lead to what's called wisdom. Again, wisdom not being a kind of know-it-all, not being about the accumulation of facts, but knowing how to navigate through life, how to see and be drawn in appropriate ways. And that reflexivity is what makes the spiritual path so expansive, I think, because it's constantly open to that which is ultimately beyond us as individuals, and yet can speak to us as individuals as well. Something that unfolds as we develop the capacity to see spiritually.